a celebration for us to be here tonight. And I'm so happy that I can be here at the very, very first opening moment of this exhibit in front of the Library Society, since without you, we would not have catalog. We would have Xerox pages stapled together of some photographs and some documents. And instead we have what I think is a pretty gorgeous catalog. I want to introduce my role in the exhibit, since you've had the opportunity to listen to Katie and Monica talk about case by case the exhibit, and they know 500,000 times more than I do about each and every moment of this. I have been the impresario of this project, which began 5 years ago and started with an oral history project. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the origins and the scope of the larger project, of which this exhibit is the culmination, and hopefully the foundation for further work, because we have only begun to tell these stories. And then I'm going to be the English professor that I am. Something like you, as a reader, although I've had a lot more time to think about it and look at it, but a reader of the exhibit and what I think it means to think about women's history of the university, how it changes our understanding of the university, and how it doesn't change our understanding of the university, in what ways this illuminates things, and in what ways we see these experiences as symmetrical to what we've known all along, or at least in mythology. Oh, is this the green thing? Okay. All right. This is our beautiful signature image and the title of the exhibit. And I want to start with the Oral History Project. And some of you may know a little bit about this. Some of you may even have given oral histories. I don't know. But we started in 2004 from two different directions. And I think this is a very important part of the way gender studies works, and was meant to work when it was women's studies in the 1970s, which was faculty and students building knowledge together. So in 2004, a colleague and I realized we didn't know very much about the history of women at the university, nor did we really know where to find that information. How were we going to know that, and where would we look? And we thought one of the ways that would help us to identify what was interesting was to talk to the alums themselves, to talk to the faculty, to talk to the staff, and to find out what in their experience was meaningful, what meant a lot to them, what they would have changed, what they missed, but to have very open-ended questions and do it as a kind of exploratory project. We ended up doing, over the course of 2005, 6, and 7, 71 oral histories, ranging from people at the university, women at the university from 1935 till about 2005. So we have a pretty smooth cohort across the decades of women talking about their experiences. I'm going to play a little bit of that for you. The CD that accompanies your catalog is really a small sample of a very, very, very small sample of hours and hours of interviews that we have with alumni, faculty, and staff, and the stories are really pretty fascinating. So we started with the Oral History Project. At the same time, several months later, some students came to us and said, we want to talk to women about the women's movement here at the University of Chicago in the late 60s and 70s. And lo and behold, we actually had some names to give them because we had started to collect names of participants. So they started the project, we started the project together, and it has always been a collaborative project at every stage between faculty and students have been the principal investigators at every stage of the project. So Katie and Monica are curators. Jen Benor is the curator of the Oral History Project, and we actually have Celeste Moore here today, who did the next step of the project, which was the finding guides. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but I want to play you something from the oral histories so that you can hear what I mean when I say we're trying to identify the questions, the things that we just didn't expect, and in some ways couldn't have expected when we started the project.
In 2004, the Center for Gender Studies undertook Exhibition Piece 14, Women in the Era of the World Wars. This period, particularly World War II, disrupted life on campus in a variety of ways for women. As Harriet Koch, class of 1945, describes,
I was acutely aware that when the veterans started to come in, at the time I was in my senior year, we enrolled a bunch of GIs, and that was a terrific impact because the boys we'd been with were 16, 17-year-olds. They were pretty young like us. All of a sudden these men were in campus.
How did you feel their impact socially?
A lot more sexual pressure to go farther, and I really didn't date them very much. I was on a couple of dates with them, but I didn't date them. The other thing I remember is that I smoked to them and that cigarettes were rationed. I don't think we didn't have rationing cards, but they were short. You know, you stood in line and you took what you could get. I think that candy bars were also kind of hard to come by.
Also, Nancy Warner, who received her BA in 1953 and her MD in 1965 from the University of Chicago, notes the impact that World War II had in opening more doors for women.
The government took over medical schools in the sense that 85% of the positions were allotted, greatly allotted to individuals of the government sense, just arbitrarily. And you might or might not be the standard for the mission for the school, but you took them anyway. So they needed doctors that were doing endeavors in the war. You know, they were fighting in two fronts, Europe and Asia. They needed doctors. So at the University of Chicago, there were 60 spots, and it ended up that the school had 12 slots available that they could pick for people. Well, there weren't any able-bodied men who were not in the service, so they took a lot of young boys, really, and 5 women, or 7 women. So they had 5 guys under 18 and 7 women.
Women on campus also contributed to the war effort in other ways, as Carol Herzenberg, class of 1958, describes.
World War II ended with dropping the N-bombs in 45. We worked from the Manhattan Project, but I didn't work on it. I met some of the people who had been involved in it. Several of my professors were there, and I actually met one woman who had been on it, or at least two women who'd been on it. But it was a secret project. You know, now everybody knows about it, but in those days people were still very quiet about it. You know, during the war years, why they were not supposed to talk about it, but I didn't even realize it. Initially, I didn't realize these women had been on the Manhattan Project. But once we started realizing, you know, hey, she was on the Manhattan Project, we decided there must have been some other women too, you know, even though you don't care about it. The women were kind of left out of the histories that were written at the time. So we decided to chase them down, and we talked to some of the women like Leona Marshall and Maria Mayer, who's the Nobel Prize winner, who was taught at UC. I took class from her. We tried to find out, you know, what other women were also involved. It just seemed like a bit of history that shouldn't be lost.
So, sort of an ongoing issue. By listening to the oral histories, we started to open up questions about how would you look at the Manhattan Project. This was not something that we thought was a question about women's history, but all of a sudden it is a question of women's history, and we wanted to find out more about it. This is not something we've been able to pursue, and there's lots of things. What happened in medical schools during the wars? All of a sudden, it just opens up and identifies questions for us that we can pursue as we go along. But there was so much wealth of information about people's lives, because there's, of course, such tremendous variety. When you talk about a women's history of the University of Chicago, you're talking about multiple vantage points, multiple experiences, people coming from all different places with all different kinds of expectations and career trajectories. So we wanted to be able to go into thinking about the history, knowing something about what women were doing here, knowing something about the social world they live in, which we do know something about, but also respecting and acknowledging the unique character of the university, knowing that the history of women's education, as we know it broadly in the United States, is not going to be replicated in identical fashion in the University of Chicago. It's going to have its own peculiar University of Chicago character, and of course it does. We were then, after we finished, we didn't finish, while we were in the process of doing the oral histories, we went to Alice Schreier to say, this is a project we think we can do with you, and for the past couple years we've been working with special collections. The first thing to do was to say, where are we going to look? And in fact, if you look at the very back page of your catalog, you see an unbelievable number of collections that were consulted. So very few of them are identified, if any of them, are identified as women's anything, right? But women are not the principal object of collection in these different things, but they're always in it, through it, participating in it, observing it. And so it becomes a question of, there it is, it's available to you, but you can't actually see it until you bring it out from the background of what you're looking at. So whether it's the president's papers or cap and gown, whether it's an individual faculty member's papers, the information is there, but it requires a special kind of attention to both make it visible, but also to make it coherent. What does it mean when you find it here, there, and everywhere? How do you find a story that makes sense? And so we were able to begin by finding guides and to decide whether or not it made sense for us to make an exhibit. Was there enough material was the question we asked ourselves in 2006, and there was more than enough. I just want to point out that this is not the first time someone has gone through the archives to figure these things out. Ruth Murray, we have a prize for Ruth Murray in the Center for Gender Studies to acknowledge her great work archiving women's studies materials from the 1970s. So we have our exhibit, and we have 68 collections, and we have all this information. We have over 100 years of history. So what does it mean to look at the university from the perspective of its women faculty, staff, students? The first thing that I think you see in the outside 12 boxes is that you have something like a university within a university. And this is not something that we have we certainly don't have a common memory of it, because most of it's older than any of us. But it's also not something that's part of the university's lore about itself. That women's lives were more administered than their male counterparts, to protect them, to help cultivate them, and it had some important effects on their experience of the college. The one place that we found, both in our exhibit and in our oral histories, that women always felt themselves to be equal participants was in the classroom itself. Now, maybe not in graduate stipends, maybe not in the faculty discussion room, maybe not in the dorm, maybe not in the street, maybe not in any number of other places, but the classroom was very consistently mentioned as the place where people felt that they were recognized and that their contributions were recognized. This is an absolute 100% true, but it is overwhelmingly true. And that was true in the early part of the college. But as you learned from Katie and Monica, we had a very thriving program in home economics. I don't think you could interview 1,000 current University of Chicago students and that one of them could tell you that home economics had been a prominent department here. I think you could probably interview 1,000 alumni and you couldn't find that information out. So the fact that this was a path that led to very important women's philanthropic enterprises, led to the social service administration and professional school, it led to a rethinking of how social work in this country is done, and is really in part related to home economics. Am I correct in saying that? Thank you. So the other thing that the inadvertent or sometimes cultivated effect of having the universe within the university is that women had very strong associations and networks of mentoring, and they had much more intergenerational contact than we typically think of college students today, or even in the recent past, that they made an effort to bring them along into the careers that they were forging to themselves, into the organizations that they were a part of in the city of Chicago and elsewhere. So those kinds of informal mentoring networks that were very important to women's lives largely dissipated as the college became more integrated after the early 1960s. So I think you can see that some of what we think of as the overprotectiveness and over-scrutiny of women's lives in that early part of the college also had some very positive effects that have not been replaced. So just a few photographs. This is women who didn't go to the prom. I think this is the time. They have a little party and they...
What year?
1902.
We didn't hear the answer.
1900,
1902.
1902. So the university, obviously, for many different reasons, all of which you know, takes a different path in the post-war years. But one of the things that happens, we heard from Nancy Warner talking about medical admissions and the effect that the war had on medical school. They had to admit more women because they had to train some doctors, and they didn't have enough men of age because so many were serving in combat. This, as many of you know from any general history of the U.S., gets rolled back after the war. What happens, and what is a very important aspect of seeing the university through women's eyes, is that women's career paths are not as linear as men's career paths. So women will become students. These are the Quonset huts that young families were living in. I'll go back to that. And they became faculty wives. They became their husband's assistants. They had other kinds of roles in the university, even processing research that their husbands were doing. There is a story that is actually often repeated among the oral histories that when the women are out on the stoops, sweeping stoops in the morning, every other one of them has a PhD. So that was a kind of joke in the 1950s about the high level of education of faculty wives, and this was actually true. So the fact that their careers don't conform to a model that we have in our minds of what career models look like means that you have to look at different things. We couldn't actually, we realized, look just at the students and just at the faculty. We really need to look at the faculty wives. Faculty wives played a huge institutional role. They did a lot of service for the university. They did a lot of service for their husbands. They were an integral part of the university, but they had no proper official role. We have actually very extensive records of the faculty wives, and so we were able to tell a story about them. But I like to think of this as happening in tandem because you don't have the opportunity to really look at them outside of their other relationships, because those relationships, particularly in the period of the late 40s through the mid-60s, were determining how they pursued their own education. So they might take time off, they might come back to their research, they might have to give it up. There's lots of different ways this happens, but the university, you're seeing two different trajectories for fully about 20 years after the war. We can listen to all histories, but I know I'm short on time, so I'm going to just go on. The 1960s and 70s, no surprise, we have a very big change in the culture. Not only all the protests that's going on around the university and around the country, around civil rights and around the war, starts to also produce a women's movement. And in this movement, the students themselves started to think about what they considered equal terms, what they considered both equal terms in the university, what should their access to healthcare be, what kinds of mentoring should they get, should they have to give up their stipend if they get married, should they be able to pursue their graduate career or their assistant professorship and have a child. And so they started to make demands on the university. Ultimately, you have the Newgarden Report and a lot of different kinds of changes get instituted, but really at the behest of the students who are, that's a very complicated period of time. It's not hard to say, but we have boxes of programs for liberation, and meetings, and so it took place. This kind of movement was not simply a political movement. It was a political movement that was also an intellectual movement. It was thinking about how do people think about, for example, core knowledge. What is it that you learn in the core? What are you being taught? Are you being taught any women? What place does gender have when you think about what is considered essential for your education? So they made up their own reading groups. They made up their own symposia. They had their own conferences. It was very much student-driven and student-generated. And so the exhibit is a very rich exhibit up through the early 70s, and after that we're gesturing towards the longer history because we don't have the archival material to tell that story in any depth. We very much want to find that archival material, we want to solicit that archival material, but we do know something because we know our students and we know something about the recent past because it's part of our collective memory. And I think the emphasis now is on not so much on trying to find what forms of symmetry there are, but also celebrating and exploring sexual difference and gender difference. And this is much more important for students today than thinking about how they can be treated equally, in part because their treatment is more equal. I can't say that it's 100% equal, but the issues that drove the earlier questions about gender and that drove their mothers and aunts and sisters to put pressure on the university to change the institution, many of those things have been remedied. Nonetheless, there are ongoing issues, as Mary Harvey will tell you in the Provost office. There's a new initiative on women, the hiring, promotion, and retention of women. So these issues are not gone. So here's a photograph that looks uncannily like the 1902 photograph, although this is the rugby team.
Annual prom dress.
That's their annual prom dress game. So it's a little different. They're not missing the prom. They're having their own prom on a rugby field and dressing for it. And I just want to make one last point. As I said, we consider this exhibit a foundation. It's a very broad exhibit. We tried to cover many different aspects of women's lives through over a century. Obviously, we were not able to go into, there's enormously detailed stories that can still be told about lots of different aspects of this. So there are still ongoing projects. There's going to be a parallel exhibit in April at the Center for Gender Studies that was based in a class taught by our two curators, and students produced their own cases on topics of their own interest, but they were allowed to explore in more detail their own interests. Any one of those could have been blown up into its own much larger project. We also have a video project that's going to start with Judy Hoffman, who's a documentarian, who's going to be collecting stories on video, sort of bouncing off the exhibit, but sort of continuing our process of recording and collecting the stories of women at the university. So the last thing I'll say is that these things are ongoing and cyclical. The course that Katie and Monica are talking about in their course alma mater is the first course they found on women at the university. It was 1892, I believe, or 1895. It's the somatic and psychic history of women, and you can't read it unfortunately, but it's all societies, every dimension of women's life in all societies in a quarter. So I think we have a little more to say, but the foundations are there. So thank you very much. I welcome your questions, but I'm going to point your questions largely to the experts on this, our oral historian, our two curators, and Celeste, if you have anything to add, please raise your hand. So thank you very much.
Can you tell us anything? Can you tell us anything about the history of the university's policy on nepotism and hiring faculty?
Curators?
Yes. Monica Turk, I mean, initially the university was very reticent to hire faculty spouses in any capacity, and almost always this meant that if a wife had a PhD and was pursuing a job at the University of Chicago, she would not be considered for that job, because you would assume her husband would have been the one who would get the job, and the wife might have gotten a job at Loyola, might have gone back for more education at UFC. Oftentimes we found that these wives who also had PhDs would end up as almost research assistants to their husbands. I think that the nepotism policy begins to change in the 60s. Right, some of the women involved in the sit-ins or in sort of the surrounding, I guess, sort of hubbub about what women would be in the post-war university, the post-60s university, point to what they see as real hypocrisy. Because while the university will hire brothers, they will, the dean will hire brothers. They won't hire a spouse, a faculty wife. And this, I think,
about sisters.
I'm sorry?
About sisters.
Too unusual to have data.
Right, unimaginable.
No, weren't the Abbott sisters in the early in the 1900s? Edith Abbott, and
That's true.
you know, I don't think your answer is really quite. I mean, you say in the early days they didn't allow nepotism, but in fact, you know, William Rainey Harper hired his younger brother, Robert Francis Harper, who was a really lousy archaeologist, but you know, he hired him. And there were the Abbott sisters, you know, and there were the sort of brothers and sisters, brothers and brothers, fathers and sons.
No, you're right. I'm saying that they were.
I think there might even have been a spousal in the chemistry department in the 30s. But you know, by the time you get to the 40s, Maria Gobet-Meyer was, who was in a different, you know, was a physicist, and her husband Joe was a chemist. You know, she was excluded from full, which was ludicrous. So, you know,
right.
There was all I'm saying is that there probably was a long series of ups and downs and very strange changes in it.
There were also, I know from the oral histories, we have several oral histories, really more than several oral histories that deal with this. There were a lot of informal practices to get around nepotism. So there's one story that I remember about the French department, some of you may or may not know this, where Madame so-and-so and Monsieur so-and-so had apartments that were next to each other, but in fact they were adjoining, because in fact they were married, but they couldn't actually be married and be in the French department, so they had this kind of, well, they're having an affair. I think they were technically thought to be married, but that they couldn't obviously be married, so there were many ways of working around this as well, but they were hardly sanctioned by the university.
Right, so I mean, I think what you were saying about brothers and sisters is absolutely right. We found that the university was much more willing to hire non-marital, based on sort of non-marital nepotism, so brothers and sisters and these types of things, but was much more reticent to hire spouses. Not to say that it never happened, but was much less common.
And we have this question gets revisited today because it's a really difficult part of recruiting senior faculty. So if you can't hire spouses, it's particularly true for women in the sciences. Something like 70% of women with who are PhDs working in the sciences are married to other scientists. The reverse is not true, but you have nepotism or spousal hiring, as it's now called, is at the forefront again of a kind of the hiring and retention of faculty, but now with a different and actually more positive slant, which is try to find somewhere for these spouses to work. But it's very complicated and departments hate it.
As long as you're doing an archival project, it seems to me, as long as you're doing an archival project, it seems to me it would be worthwhile to see if the Board of Trustees at some point in the 1960s made a positive statement to say, we are rescinding the old policy.
Right.
And
is that part of the Newgarden report?
Pretty much all the Newgarden report. I mean, I think pretty much all the Newgarden report says is that typically the university has frowned upon hiring the spouse of a faculty member, and that typically that was a question of what to do with the woman. But the Newgarden report in 1970 does sort of start to acknowledge that it's possible that a woman professor might be recruited and they might have to find a job for her husband. So as early as 1970, they're thinking about how these dynamics work.
So actually, it may be somewhat later that the policies start to change, but right, it's something we should.
There should be an example of Hannah and Charles Gray.
Yeah.
There are lots of yes, and there are.
I mean, I should also mention too that this is one of the challenges as curators of this project. The nepotism or special hiring in particular is something that was very much informal. It was department by department. And not only do we not have records of certain departments or practices, I mean, this is an example where we really had to start the oral histories and then try to figure out if we even had documentation to figure out, one clear story that we could tell there. And that's just one example.
Right, and there's other things where people are, where their hiring sequence is murky, and we have trouble figuring out who the spouse would have been, right? So that they're not voluminous numbers of cases, but there are cases of these. So we even went and backtracked some of these cases, and a lot of these records are not part of any public access files. So it is it's not like it was an official policy that was mandated centrally, as nothing is here, right? We sort of have policies, but largely it's every fiefdom on its own.
I was very interested in that Jane project. I assume it was independent of the university, but What was it about? How did it get founded? I mean, obviously there's probably a need
Here,
for
let
it.
me play you a little tune on my iTunes.
The Jane Project.
Exhibition Case 21, Women's Health and Abortion Rights. The issue of rape, birth control, and access to health care became particularly salient in the 1960s as Deanna Bennett, class of 1967, and Robin Kaufman, class of 1965, both described.
Now, we were in the middle of, I'd say, the sexual revolution and everything like that, and there were lots more options. I mean, I knew gals who were on the pill, who were sleeping with their boyfriend. We had other people who were on the pill and who, that's the kind of thing I don't think you would kind of overtly or openly do. As a matter of fact, there was one person I knew who actually was, in fact, even though not on paper, living at a fraternity with her boyfriend. And that was a lot of experimentation and living at that time. Everybody taking their studies quite seriously, started taking the world very seriously. Those are just some kind of things. I know the women's movement was starting. Going in her bed, in campus housing, on campus.
Let me just bring back this up. This is shoot.
Exhibition BC.
I cleaned up, I did the laundry. Every once in a while we'd have some discussion about who's doing some stuff, but he never quite mastered it.
I have Heather Booth on here who founded Jane.
Women's Health and Abortion Rights. The issue of rape, birth control, and access to health care became particularly salient in the 1960s as also prompted Heather Booth, class of 1967, to go on and start the controversial and now famous abortion project, Jane, at the university.
One of the things that happened, I thought it was 65, is that a friend of mine was raped at knife point in her bed in campus housing, off campus but student housing. And when she went to student health for gynecological exam, she was both told student health to cover gynecological exams, and she was given a lecture on promiscuity. But this was sort of a pre-women's movement. It was just feeling like this isn't how you should treat people. And later in 65, the sister of a friend of mine, who had also been in Mississippi in the summer project, was pregnant and needed an abortion. I hadn't really thought about the issue before, but I contacted a doctor through the Medical Committee for Human Rights, again on the basis that when someone's in need, you respond to their needs. I didn't view it as a political act, I just viewed it as something you do to help someone. And the abortion was successful. And a few months later, word spread, and someone else called me, it was successful. Word spread again. So I talked with the doctor more systematically, and we also negotiated on the price. The price had been $500 for one. We negotiated it down to almost half of that. We created a scholarship fund, and I was a student, so we had a student model. And I was living in New Dorms at the time, and I told people to call and ask for Jane.
That's just a
Heather
Booth.
The woman question interview. Esther Newton is a PhD from the University of Chicago and lived in Hyde Park in the 1960s. Seven being a graduate.
The main thing is whether you stayed or not, aside from your motivation, was whether you...
Oh, I can pull the plug. Okay. Anyway, Heather Booth is one of our oral history participants, and it's a really fascinating story. So it has started in this ad hoc way of providing help to friends, and then became an organized movement.
I want to do a quick advertisement.
Yes.
During reunion this year, on June 6th, the Saturday of reunion, we're going to be hosting an Uncommon Core panel in the afternoon, which Debbie and the curators and some other faculty are going to be at. And Heather Booth has agreed to come to that panel to talk a little bit more. So if you're interested, I hope you'll attend that.
What was the date?
It's Saturday, June 6th.
June 6th.
Right.
Yeah. So, we have a lot of information on Jane, and we were able to get them to loan us their material, because it started by UC women. It was obviously not an official UC project, but it was a group of University of Chicago students. Yeah.
Well, I know that you mentioned there are limitations to a project like this, but I was wondering if you had an opportunity to examine the trends for women of color in the university.
there are definitely, I think, a lot of, we could say, holes in our research. And in some ways, we were both, we approached this project seeing how much there was in special collections, but in other ways, we had a lot of difficulty documenting other trends, other forces, and certain women. And certainly, I think women of color were particularly difficult for us to trace without knowing who certain women were. Certainly until the 60s and 70s, we didn't see organized groups of students organizing around their racial or ethnic identity. So in fact, it was sort of hard to go back as much as we could through yearbooks, through the sort of things we have to document student life from the much earlier years. Certainly we found some correspondence early on about student housing and questions about whether or not an African American woman could live in housing, I believe in the teens or the 20s. And that woman actually went on, her name's Georgiana Simpson, and I believe she got a master's and a PhD here in the 20s. But we really, I think we're challenged in some ways. I mean, this exhibition is sort of the end of some of our research and then beginning of a lot more research. Maybe not by Katie and I, but I think the stuff must be there, but we just haven't found it yet.
And I think another way to do this is through the oral histories, where we actually have a couple of great oral histories in the Ida Noyes case about Paul Robeson coming to Ida Noyes and meeting with an African American group after a performance of Othello with Uta Hagen. So who knows that this exists? And so you think, wow, fabulous. We follow that up with we now know that the group meets at Ida Noyes. So there's a group, we know where it meets. We can start to piece together different aspects of it. We know it was an intercollegiate group. There were members from other colleges, so we might be able to look at their archives. I mean, so you start to be able to find out traces of things that just aren't in the archives as we have now fairly thoroughly canvassed them anyways. Like, we don't know every bit of them, but we've looked at what is there, and so that's one way to do it. And we worked hard in oral histories to have as much diversity as we could in lots of different ways: age diversity, racial diversity, religious diversity, position in the university diversity, so that we could have a lot of different perspectives and start to get, we can always do a lot more oral histories, but we then could focus around the different kind of cohort if we were going to try to look for those, and we'd still have the oral histories. We have several oral histories from that era of the 40s by African American women, so you could have a start. You have to come at it from lots of different directions.
How easy is it to trace find information about individual students? And one reason I asked the question was, I noted recently that on the plaque in Rockefeller Chapel about people from the university community killed in World War I, there were 3 women, and I thought, is there a way to find who they were? I mean, aside from names, but is that easy to do? Relatively easy.
I mean, I think that we can both talk about places where it is easy to sort of look for individuals and places where it's been harder. So one example is that we had a lot of correspondence from the early years, parents corresponding with administrators. One particular letter, we actually used it in the exhibition and in the class that we taught, was from a very concerned father who was sort of taking his daughter out of school for a while. He didn't know if she should stay in school, if it would sort of hurt her attempt to maybe have a family later. We had all this information about the father, where they lived, but we didn't really know who the daughter was until we were in the class that Katie and I taught, and our students said, well, who's the daughter? What's her story? Did she go to school? And I mean, it took work. I mean, I sort of had to go out into special collections, we knew the letter was from 1910. I pulled yearbooks from 1910 to 1920 and just looked for her last name. And I found her, in one case of actually finding her. I found this daughter. She did graduate in 1914. She had done a lot of clubs. She was a prolific writer. But it took a lot of sort of me sitting, having to go through each book. I think, Julia Gardner, the reference librarian, who's here, could probably speak to that as well, but sort of trying to find comprehensive lists. Luckily, she was an undergraduate student. There's not similar yearbook listings, say, for graduate students. So that's an example where you could sort of connect the dots, but there are other places, I think, that it's harder.
Yeah, I would just add, I think it would depend on what kind of information you wanted to find about individual people. So if it's a plaque about World War I, if we knew what year the person graduated, we could look through registrars' records, transcripts from their grades, look in the yearbooks. But again, as Monica was saying, plenty of women didn't have such a linear connection to the university. So while we have actual entire collections of some women students, lots and lots of material related to their life after the university, but also their life as a student, there are plenty of women whose faces and whose names we don't have access to. And I think Monica would agree with me that we wish we had more information about all different types of people at the university, but we just don't.
Right, and it's also, I think, just one quick point about that is that you can't look in a 4-year gap. You actually have to look in a much broader time frame because they might leave and come back. So that you have to have, so that their itinerary might be much different than we just sort of conventionally think of. They could come back under a married name. Whoops. Then you have another record keeping.
And in my example, there was no evidence they were students.
Right.
Brothers.
Right.
I'm curious about your process of finding hidden women in the archives and the large number of collections that you looked at. Did you go into these collections looking for specific women? Did you look through all the collections and find women? Did you have any methodology at all for approaching these collections that weren't obviously about women?
I'll let Katie speak to this as well, but we sort of entered the project in the winter of 07, 08, and we made a big spreadsheet. We listed all the collections that we could think of that we thought students, faculty, and women's staff might be in. We split them up. I started, for example, in the president's papers, and I sort of started going through finding guides looking for things that, looking for women's names, certainly, but also looking for groups or events that I knew might be related to women. So building of Ida Noyes, I looked in the buildings and grounds records, right? So there's certainly architectural drawings of Ida Noyes that were not useful to my project, but also led me to really interesting documents about women's housing in the 1950s. And so, some of those bigger collections I think were particularly challenging because, so the president's papers, for example, took months, right? They're from 1892 until the 1970s. We have papers and extensive finding guides. And so in some ways it was just guesswork. In other ways, then we would find out a name maybe from a different collection that we could then go back and trace in the others. Luckily we had sort of the time and almost the leisure to be in the archives for a number of months. And so I think that helped us cull so much of this stuff. If we had been told to sort of put this together in maybe 2 or 3 months, it might not have been as extensive.
And we were also lucky we had 2 of you, right? We initially didn't plan to hire 2 curators. We planned to hire 1 curator, and because that seemed to make sense, and we were so incredibly lucky that we could actually have 2 people checking and also cross-checking. So Monica's point that you find out one thing and then it makes you think differently about the thing you looked at earlier is really important. The pieces start to come together. Oh, that's what that was about. And then you can start to fill in the blanks.
Yeah, and I can say, so Monica looked at a lot of the bigger collections, the president's papers, whereas I took more of the smaller collections. So SSA, School of Social Sciences, Social Services, was one of the big collections that I looked at, but I knew there would be its own story to tell. I knew that SSA would probably have its own case, if not maybe even 2 cases, because it's been such an important part of women's experience at the university. But in terms of challenges, I would oftentimes get excited about knowing that there was a particular woman's papers that I was going to be looking at. If you look at the checklist, you'll see the names of individual women. And so I thought, surely these would be really relevant and important for the exhibit, but oftentimes if it's a one woman's collection, it might just be her notes from class. Or it might be, if she's an English professor, it might just be her notes from a lecture about Victorian poetry or something. So, as Monica was saying, many times the sort of collections that didn't seem on their face to be related to women, even the collections that were collected by women, weren't necessarily telling an interesting story, just more than that they were there, I suppose.
For various reasons that I won't bother explaining, I happen to know a lot about Marion Talbot. And
so do they.
And in the past couple of years, I've been trying to get people interested in Marion Talbot. And I start by saying, go into the Reynolds Club, you'll see all these portraits, guy, Mrs. Gray, and then this person, Marion Talbot. Aren't you at all curious about who she was and why she's in such august company? And people, most often, University of Chicago people and women, University of Chicago women, they look at me totally blank. Big jump to I happened to get a copy of Elaine Showalter's new book, A Jury of Her Peers, last week when I was up at Women and Children First. And she talks about how you have to continually bring the same people back and back. And it's like the minute you say their name and remember them, they're forgotten again. Why do you think, from a larger perspective, what have you all learned in this process about how women disappear, even when you bring them back?
That's a great point. I mean, that's been an issue in the field of women's and gender studies for, I would say 20 years. Let's think of the field as 40 years. And so the first 20 years in the early 70s, discovery, remember, and then everyone had the expectation that this was going to change what knowledge was. And then 20 years later, you're like, I got to teach this again, I got to discover this again, we have to reintroduce this again. You start to realize the fragility of that history and why it doesn't, I mean, I think you have the kind of strange oscillation between what I think of as a problem institutionalization. So if it gets institutionalized in its own pathway only, right, it's easy to dismiss. So if it's all taking place in gender studies, then it doesn't have to take place in sociology and English and anthropology and history. And then if it's dispersed throughout it, it can become so minor in those areas so that you need like concentration and dispersal. You need both of those things to be working at the same time, because that's how you become part of the collective memory, and that it's very hard to become part of the collective memory. I mean, I'm very curious what will happen. You know, if we think about this exhibit, we think about this university in a different way. If we look at this, we think about its history and its evolution in a different way. But there are very, very powerful myths. How do you become part of the mythology? And that's how you get to be part of conventional memory, ordinary memory, rather than scholarly memory. Scholarly memory, yeah, you can easily look up a lot of these things. Who's Marion Talbot? Blah, 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 blah. You know, but to become part of the university's memory, can Marion Talbot be a figure like Hutchins? For the women of the first half of the century, she was the organizing figure of their education. She determined their curriculum, she determined what they wore, how they socialized, whether they could, how their dorm life operated, what kinds of clubs they could join. I mean, it's absolutely, you would never permit such supervision at this point. But she dictated basically everything that happened to them. So for them to think about the University of Chicago without Marion Talbot is inconceivable. And yet she's not a part. So, whatever percentage of students and faculty were involved with Talbot's administration, that was their university. But it should be our university. She should be part of our university. That is what our university is. And so how do you move into that category? You who know more about Marion Talbot, can you please say something?
We could say lots and lots of things about Marion Talbot, but I think more largely it points to the fact that, Katie and I were graduate students and we didn't go here as undergrads, so we sort of came in the last few years to the U of C, also knowing the sort of stories that the U of C tells of itself. which don't necessarily involve women. So we knew about the order system being sort of an innovation here, about Hutchins College, as Debbie is saying, about the Great Books movement. And those are the sort of stories that the UC tells about itself. You can find on the homepage or in stories about the university. And so for us, I mean, we sort of put that aside in a lot of ways and sort of delved into these collections to sort of see what was going on sort of parallel to these movements, and then what else we could tell and what sort of new stories we could insert. I mean, Debbie's right that who knows if we'll get them to stick.
Yeah, make it stick.
But certainly, I mean, we've come across, especially fundamentally powerful women like Marion Talbot, who so much drove, 50% of the university for a long period of time. These stories were new to us, and we kept coming across new stories with every collection we opened, every time we went into another yearbooks or course registers. And that's just the beginning. I mean, we still don't know a lot of things either.
I guess I could just add, Monica and I are both graduate students in women's history in particular, and I think a lot of women's history is written with sort of equality of access as the ultimate goal, so that once women broke into certain professions, once women broke into certain educational sort of institutions, that they had achieved parity and everything was equal and wonderful. So I think you could imagine a story of the University of Chicago that just sort of started with, well, they were there from 1892, women were there alongside of men, therefore what an amazing co-educational school this was, what amazing opportunities women had, they were surely equal. And so I think part of what Monica and I wanted to do was look at, well, if we put the myths aside, as Monica was saying, a figure like Marion Talbot is incredibly important, but doesn't really fit the university's myth about sort of equality, I think, and almost a place where anyone who's qualified can participate fully in the life of the mind, the life of the university. And while that's been true, it's also been really complicated. And administrators, again and again, while they represented themselves as entirely sort of in control and sort of orchestrating things, they're also incredibly nervous. And they're taking on this great experiment of co-education with a lot of trepidation. And so I think when Monica and I kind of put the myths aside about what the University of Chicago is and has always been, we found a much different story, I think, and a story into which Marion Talbot fits very squarely. But I think if you sort of take the university's self-imagining as your starting point, you wouldn't understand where she fit at all, I'd say.
Why don't we finish the conversation out with